Hey everyone, how's it going? I come to you for yet another Sunday Miscellany video. For those who are new to the channel or new to this feature on my channel, this is a weekly video where I give a reading update similar to a Friday Reads, but also talk about the music, some of the highlights from the music that I listen to, and I leave a playlist of some of the highlights of the music that I've listened to, and to talk some about the movies that I've watched. And this week I'm going to talk about a couple of TV shows that I've started this week. I don't always talk about the TV shows I'm watching just because if you're, in the middle of a season of a show, it's not all that interesting to just say, well, yeah, the story continued on a little bit from here, But I like to talk about shows when I've just started them. And maybe I'll check back in when I finish them or something like that. But anyway, yeah, so I thought that just for kicks I would show you my mug today. This is a Wyoming mug, a Starbucks mug, which is appropriate because I'm reading Moby-Dick, and Starbucks is named after Starbuck, the first mate of the Pequod. So actually this is very appropriate. But yeah, this was sent to me, I want to say around Thanksgiving time in 2019 by Jason and Kelly from, well, you know them by now, Old with Chapter and Verse and Books I'm Not Reading. But yeah, so it's another early morning Sunday Miscellany. This is my first cup of coffee for the day. But anyway, yeah, I like doing these early in the morning. It just feels kind of cozy, like a nice way to start the day. I do have a busy day ahead of me. I have several things I want to make sure I get done. Like I want to bake some potatoes, I want to clean my kitchen a little bit, I want to do my stationary bike, get a little exercise, I want to walk down to a little free library and drop off some books that I want to get rid of. So I have a bit, and then I have a Zoom call at 1 o'clock with a good friend of mine, and then another Zoom call at 8 or so, and before that I have to watch a movie because that's the film club that I'm a part of with some people from some in real life friends, as well as one booktuber who you may know who's joining in. So I have a full day ahead of me, but I want to get this shot because because obviously I enjoy doing these and people seem to enjoy them. But anyway, that's enough throat clearing. I will go on to the music. This week I have been, as many of you may remember, I've been reading Moby-Dick for March of the Mammoths, which is a yearly reading event that takes place in March, where Jason from Old with Chapter and Verse, myself, and Alex from Big Apple Books encourage people to read books that are 800 or more pages, and for that I'm reading Moby-Dick. And so in honor of that, I've been listening to this one particular album, and the album is 25 by Adele, and that may seem like an odd choice because they're not really thematically related at all, but I have this weird association between Adele's 25 and Moby-Dick, because when I read Moby-Dick for the first time a few years ago when I was in college, I was still living with my parents, and I had just given my mom Adele's 25 for Christmas. My mom is a big Adele fan, and she was playing it on repeat basically the whole time I was reading Moby-Dick. So I have this association between the two pieces of art, and so whenever I read Moby-Dick, I think of Adele's 25. Whenever I listen to Adele's 25, I think of Moby-Dick. So I've been listening to Adele's 25, which it's one of those albums that I know like the back of my hand, But anyway, I'm leaving a couple of my favorite songs from that in the playlist this week. I also took a recommendation from a couple of different commenters and listened to Soul Station by Hank Mobley, a jazz saxophonist, really kind of lyrical music, lyrical and lovely. So there's one track by him. I also listened to this album. I'm not really sure of the genre. I want to say it's sort of post-rock, but like, yeah, I don't know. But the album is called For the First Time, and the band is called Backcountry New Road. And I really enjoyed it. I detected maybe little jazzy influences in it, but what it really reminded me of was Spiderland, if you know that album by Slint. One of the greatest albums of the 90s for sure, but one of the greatest post-rock albums ever written. That is a great album. That's a must listen, I would say. And this album reminded me a fair amount of that, so if you like that, you might like this. So there will be 2 tracks from that in the playlist. And then I also listened to a bunch of opera this week. I don't know, well, I sort of know why I was doing it. I was working on a project, I was finishing up a project that involved a lot of mindless drudge work, and so what's nice to do while I'm doing mindless drudge work is I turn on an opera and it makes me a little bit less sad. So I listened to 3 operas this week, and one of them It's a huge opera, huge in the sense of being like 4.5 hours long. So I listened to Parsifal by Richard Wagner, and I listened to the version that is on Spotify with Jessie Norman as Kundry, and I love Jessie Norman. Her singing is fantastic. She has such a powerful voice. I love her. Yeah, Parsifal is such a cool opera, and it has so much to it. Maybe not say to the story, but the music is like verging on modernist, which I think is really cool. And so anyway, there will be a couple of tracks from that. As I would definitely recommend that you at least listen to the overture to Parsifal. That's like one of my favorite pieces of orchestral music ever, so I definitely recommend that, but there are a couple of other tracks in there. I also listened to Charles Gounod's Romeo and Juliet, his adaptation of the great Shakespeare play. And the version that I listened to had Andrea Bocelli as Romeo, and that was lovely. I love Andrea Bocelli's voice. But yeah, Gounod can really write catchy, lovely tunes. I think this was the perfect opera for him to write. So there are a couple of tracks from there. I'm trying to keep the playlist short this week, so I'm only including a couple from each piece. But then the centerpiece of the week, and I'll get to elaborating on it in a minute, for me, musically, is The Magic Flute by Mozart, obviously, which is one of his most famous operas, one of his most popular operas, certainly one of the greatest operas ever written. A lot of people might say it is the greatest opera ever written, and while it's not exactly to my taste as far as operas go, I would I would have a hard time disagreeing with people who would say that The Magic Flute is the best ever, so there you go. But I will never deny that it has some fantastic tunes in it, some really catchy tunes, but something that I think is really clever about it, and that I think really is what's great about Mozart, is something that is written in this book. This is the New York Times Essential Library opera, and this is by Anthony Tomasini. And so there's like an essay in here, a very, very, very short essay on 100 different operas, and he just talks about the opera, what it's about, some of the qualities of it, and then gives a recommendation for recordings. But I want to read to you one passage that he writes about the Magic Flute, which I think says a lot about Mozart just in general, and I love it. So here's the passage. More than in almost any other score, the score being the Magic Flute, Mozart achieves his oft-articulated goal of writing music that provides surface delights to all, but also subtleties only connoisseurs will appreciate. For example, the little song that Papageno sings to introduce himself, Der Vogelfänger bin ich ja, sorry about my German, seems at first just a simple folk tune with a repetitive rhythmic pattern that swings along in a jaunty 2/4 meter. Yet, note-wise, the tune is a string of 2-measure units, each one different from the rest. There are no repetitions until the end of each verse. This crafty subtlety suggests to listeners, at least subliminally, that Papageno is a creature of spontaneity, that he lives for the moment and makes it up as he goes along. So, anyway, I just thought I would read that to you. The Magic Flute is a delightful opera. If you're not super into opera yet and you want an easy opera to get into, it would be a good choice, because a lot of it is spoken dialogue rather than music, and most of the music is extremely catchy. So, yeah, but I also, if you're an opera buff, I would recommend this book. It's really fun. It's really nice. It's very short essays. It's fun to graze around in. But anyway, I'm gonna take a sip of my coffee. The real centerpiece of my musical week was a production of the Magic Flute that I watched. So, for those of you who aren't aware, the Metropolitan Opera has not, been running during the pandemic for obvious reasons, but what they've been doing to sort of give their audience, their opera fix, if they should so desire it, they've been doing these streams of old recordings of opera productions from the Met's catalog. And they've been doing it now for almost exactly a year. I've watched a few. I don't watch them religiously, but a lot of them have been really, really good that I have watched. And this week, they streamed Julie Taymor's production of The Magic Flute. Now, Julie Taymor is extremely well known as a film director. She has also done some work in the theater and in musical theater. I know she did a production of The Lion King at one point for musical theater, and she's directed several films. I've only seen one of her films, and I really disliked it, and it's made it really hard for me to watch anything else by Julie Taymor, but I was intrigued when I saw that she directed this production of the Magic Flute, just because, you know, she is an extremely imaginative director. I will certainly give her that. And this production was extremely imaginative. You could see that Julie Taymor just really let her imagination just run away with her. This production is full of puppets, really cool little puppets, with animals, especially flying animals, land animals. My favorite puppets were probably a bunch of dancing polar bears who appear at one point. I certainly got a kick out of them, and they were operated by people from behind who, well, obviously that's the point of a puppet, but the people had, you know, hooks on their wrists and ankles, and they sort of directed the polar bears' movements like that. And there's a really funny scene where these polar bears are dancing, and it's interesting. And there are a lot of other, again, flying creatures, and there's like a giant peacock at one point there. They're also dancing flamingos in this production of the Magic Flute. The Magic Flute is an opera that tends to inspire a lot of extremely imaginative productions, because it itself is this kind of whimsical, fantastical opera with a kind of strange story, but I enjoyed it. I thought it was fun. It's not to my taste as far as opera productions go. I tend to like opera productions that stay pretty traditional. I like sort of semi-period costumes, and I also tend to enjoy it when there's some really clever sort of gimmick in the opera production. You know, I saw this production of La Traviata on the live stream once, where they had the bed that La Traviata, that Violetta herself was dying on, in the middle of the set for the entire opera. And you would think that that would get very obtrusive, and you would might seem pretentious, but it didn't at all. It totally worked, and it worked especially well in the scenes where the opera itself brings you back to the fact that Violetta is on her deathbed. So I like little gimmicks like that. I like clever productions. I also really like sort of spare modern productions. And what you'll notice about all of those things that I like about opera productions is that none of them is true of this Julie Taymor production, because, you know, again, it has crazy costumes, you know, flying animals, puppets, huge spectacle. I mean, the Queen of the Night had like flags flying behind her the entire time. It was insane. But good. It was good. If that sounds like your thing, you would like it. I don't know how you would come across it, but I just thought I would review Julie Taymor's production of the Magic Flute because I thought it would be a fun time. But anyway, so that is the music. I'm gonna take another sip of my coffee. So that's the music, and now I move on to books. I finished 2 books this week, so a very good reading week. I actually finished them both in one day, which is always kind of fun. Isn't something I get to do very often, but I will start with those 2. So the first one of those is Assata, an autobiography by Assata Shakur. Assata Shakur is most well known as a prominent member of the Black Panther Party, and for getting falsely convicted of a murder that she did not commit. But then she escaped from prison and defected to Cuba, and I believe is still residing in Cuba in sort of hiding from the United States government. And so this is the story of her life. There are actually 2 different timelines, so to speak, in this book. One is from her childhood to when she joined the Black Panther Party. So basically the long-term life story that got her to where she was, to where she was getting convicted, where she was being put on trial for this supposed crime that she committed. And then the other timeline is her sort of being in and out of different prisons, being tried for various crimes, most of which she didn't commit. And that's the second timeline. And it ends with the 2 sort of meeting, and with her talking a little bit about her life in Cuba. And I thought that this was one of the best autobiographies I've read in a long time. I thought it was really gripping, which I wouldn't have expected, you know, especially in the timeline that's just about her living in prison, living in different prisons, going to different trials, struggling with these trials, with getting a jury who isn't racist, with keeping a lawyer, with judges who are incredibly biased against her, who are incredibly racist. All that I didn't necessarily expect to be super thrilling to read, but I was extremely interested the entire time. It really is just a testament to just the racism inherent in the prison and criminal justice system. And I will say also there are some really moving passages about the conditions in prisons, particularly women's prisons, but you also just see the way that Assata Shakur herself was treated, and if it doesn't make you angry, then I don't know what's wrong with you. But I also really liked the other half of the story about her growing up, becoming a member of the Black Panther Party. I tend to really enjoy coming-of-age memoirs about young people sort of finding themselves, finding their way in life, and there was obviously a lot of that in there, and it was sort of her having this revolutionary awakening, you know, having this awakening to the idea that, you know, life could be better for her and other black people, and that she should fight to improve, you know, make the United States government not racist or anti-racist or whatever term you want to use. And it was really interesting to see her go through that whole process of going from kind of, as she puts it, like semi-brainwashed by the American media about, for example, the Vietnam War, to, you know, an awakened revolutionary who can see all the injustices going on around her. Which doesn't say she was blind to racism when she was younger, of course, just there were aspects of what the United States was doing that she wasn't aware of, that she became aware of, and which led her to become a member of the Black Panther Party. And I found all that extremely interesting. It's like a sort of educational kind of memoir in that sense too, because, you know, there's a lot of learning about capitalism, racism, and all these sorts of things. And I tend to really enjoy those. I just find it really interesting how people's thinking develops. And yeah, so it was a really, really good memoir. And there was some really good writing too. This memoir is also peppered with poems that Shakur wrote. And I won't say that they're great poems, but they do have a kind of moving earnestness to them. And there is one poem with a line that I did absolutely love. And if I can find, oh yeah, so that one line that I really loved from all these poems is this. I'll read it to you. Love is contraband in hell. And I really liked that line. So anyway, yeah, if you're interested, if any of the stuff that I said about this book is interesting to you, then I think I can definitely recommend this book. So that is Assata. I finally finished it, you know, 2 weeks overdue. But anyway, yeah. The 1 second, coffee. The other book that I finished was Wallace Stevens's 1942 poetry collection, Parts of a World, which I read in my bind-up of the collected poetry and prose of Wallace Stevens here, which is also in a lovely box set. Well, not box set, sorry, slipcase. And Parts of a World was really, really good. There were poems in it that I didn't care for. There were poems in it that blew me away. That's always what I expect, even from my favorite poets, and Wallace Stevens is my favorite poet of all time. And, you know, he writes in this collection, as in many other collections, about the transience of perception and how what we perceive is less dependent on what's actually there and more dependent on the way that we think. It's about the transience of belief in that sense as well, because, you know, you can't have any belief without any perception in a way, and the transience of life, of course, as well, and the transience of meaning in the world. And a lot of the poems in here seemed to be continuations of his poem Sunday Morning, which is my favorite poem of all time, which is all about religious belief and the death of belief and what to do to find meaning in the world in the face of the loss of faith. And he has this sort of life philosophy that I think I would call optimistic nihilism, or maybe heroic nihilism, and that is espoused a lot in Parts of a World as well. The weakest aspect of Parts of a World, I think, is this recurring motif of soldiers going off to war. You know, he writes, there's actually a prose paragraph at the end talking a little bit about soldiers going off to war and how that was partly an inspiration for the collection, and I just found those parts to be kind of weak, and I never really knew what he was saying, and when I could figure it out, I didn't care for what he was saying about soldiers in war. I mean, it's sort of the stuff you would expect, you know, like they're these lost youths, you know, they're going to die young, many of them, they're going to be traumatized, this sort of thing. And I just didn't always quite get what he was saying, and when I did get it, I wasn't all that compelled. So that was probably the weakest aspect. But yeah, I don't expect any poetry collection to be like perfect all the way through, because it's just not going to happen. You know, collections of essays, collections of short stories, collections of poems, not every piece included can be great, okay? So anyway, a good collection. Wallace Stevens is still my favorite poet, and reading this collection reminded me why, and makes me want to go back and reread all of my favorites by him. But anyway, there's Parts of a World. And then, of course, the big one that I've been reading this week is Moby-Dick by Herman Melville. And I am now 175 pages into it, and I am just loving it. It is just like blowing my mind, because this is one of those books that I would have absolutely ranked as one of my favorite books ever before March of the Mammoths, before this reread. But now that I'm rereading it, I'm realizing that it's even better than I remember, which is insane, because again, I would have already called it one of my favorite books. And it has one of my favorite openings ever, and I don't necessarily mean Call Me Ishmael, but that whole paragraph I think is just incredible. There's this Whitmanian quality to Herman Melville's prose, and I think Melville and Whitman actually did live near each other. I think they lived in New York City at the same time, which is just wild when you think about it, when you think about the fact that these two writers, who I don't believe ever met, these two geniuses, lived so close to each other, probably passed by each other in the street, maybe even exchanged words at some point without realizing without either of them realizing who the other was. But anyway, there's a Whitmanian quality to his prose that I just find incredibly seductive, because I love Whitman, but also it's just lovely. There's a sort of stream of consciousness kind of style to the prose, which I had sort of forgotten about, but it is, you know, a first-person perspective, and you can see in that, I think, it's kind of influence on modernist writers like James Joyce and William Faulkner, and perhaps D.H. Lawrence, who is one of the writers who sort of rehabilitated Moby-Dick's reputation as a novel. Moby-Dick, when it was first released, for those who don't know, it was not well received. It was panned, basically. No one liked it. And so it languished in obscurity until the early 20th century, when writers like D.H. Lawrence and William Faulkner began to praise it, and then it was accepted as a proper American masterpiece. And yeah, it has this stream of consciousness style, which I can see as a direct influence on a lot of those writers, which I had just forgotten about. But another thing that I'm noticing in it is a lot of referentiality. I have detected, just based on my own sort of not limited knowledge, references to the Bible, of course. There's a mention of Lazarus, there's a mention of Paul being at sea, so the book of Acts. There's a very explicit reference to Hamlet, Macbeth, and I also think I've seen one reference to Tennyson's Ulysses. And at first, I didn't think that that could be a reference, because I thought that Tennyson's Ulysses probably was published after Moby-Dick, but in fact it was published about 20 years before it. So Herman Melville could definitely have been reading Tennyson and been inspired by that poem, and that poem is about seafaring. You know, it's actually about in a way, dying at sea, as Moby-Dick sort of is. And so, yeah, a lot of referentiality, and, you know, it's one of the pleasures of going back to a book after having become a lot more well-read, because, you know, you notice all of these references that the author makes that you couldn't have noticed before. And, yeah, that's a pleasure. I mean, it just makes me kind of happy with how my reading has been going, that I can pick out those references, you know what I mean? But they also add resonances, right? Because, you know, now we can make connections between these works of literature, and they can enhance our relationship with them. So anyway, that's a lot of fun. And I think Melville, too, like Tolstoy, like George Eliot, like Jane Austen, like Shakespeare, like perhaps Charles Dickens, has just this genius for character that the best fiction writers have. Can just create a character in a paragraph, you know, in a page. You know, he just has a genius for that, like these other great fiction writers. And yeah, I have such a pleasure in just basking in that ability. And yeah, I cannot wait to continue reading this book. The Pequod has only just set sail, so we're about to get into the notorious whaling chapters, which I happen to actually really enjoy. I actually really like all the whaling talk in Moby-Dick, so I'm really excited for all this. So anyway, I am looking forward to talking about this book more. I will certainly be giving you updates throughout March. It is, again, my pick for March of the Mammoths. But yeah, and also, I have to say, this may become a month where I sort of degenerate into nerding out over Moby-Dick, because I requested 2 books from my library, and one of them is Bloom's Notes on Moby-Dick by Herman Melville. So this is a series of slim little sort of pamphlets that Harold Bloom edited, the late Harold Bloom edited. And it has an introduction by Harold Bloom, a plot summary and thematic analysis, and then excerpts from essays about Moby-Dick, just covering various aspects of it. And yeah, so it's slim. I might read it this month, I might not, I might just poke around in it, I'm not sure, but you know, I couldn't resist. And then this here is Why Read Moby-Dick by Nathaniel Philbrick, who also wrote a history book about the sort of historical Moby-Dick, or the whale ship Essex, the historical ship that was destroyed by the historical Moby-Dick. And yeah, so this is all just about, you know, the greatness of Moby-Dick. And yeah, and these are both short, so maybe I can fit them in this month, but if not, then I'll just be sort of, I don't know, nerding out over them. We'll see. But anyway, so my TBR for this week, I usually end my reading my book sections of these videos with that. Obviously, I will be continuing with Moby-Dick. I will be reading Whereas by Layli Longsoldier, will be my slim volume of poetry for the week. And then I really want to read through this, Leonardo da Vinci, The Complete Paintings by Frank Zöllner. I was going to save this until later in the month, but I only just realized that this is due back at the library soon, and I can't renew it, so I want to just get it read, and it should be easy. It's most of the pages are just paintings, and so it's going to be a quick read. So that's what I'll be reading this week. Anyway, those are the books. So we're done with the books. I'll take another sip of my coffee. Now to the final section where I talk about the films, and in this case, television shows that I've been watching. So I watched 3 movies this week. I'm gonna excuse me. I'm gonna try to limit myself to 3 movies per week for the rest of the year, maybe 4, because I have 2 film clubs that I am in. There's one that I host with Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse. We watch a movie there every week. I have another club that meets on Sundays, so I'll be meeting with them later today, where we watch a movie every week. And then, so that's 2 movies a week. And then I thought I could watch 1 movie by myself. But I'm considering maybe expanding that and saying I can watch 1 movie by myself that's a rewatch and 1 that's new. So that'll motivate me to rewatch stuff and allow me to watch new stuff. But we'll see. I don't want these Sunday Miscellany videos to all be an hour long. So, you know, I don't want to be covering, you know, 6 different movies like I was last week, if you know what I mean. But anyway, so 3 movies this week. I watched Snowpiercer, directed by Bong Joon-ho, Pieces of a Woman, directed by Kornél Mundruczó, and Melancholia, directed by Lars von Trier. And so to start with Snowpiercer, this is directed by Bong Joon-ho, who directed Parasite, which is probably the film of his that everyone who's watching this video will at least have heard of if they haven't seen it. And I rather liked Parasite. I was a little bit puzzled by the rapturous response that it got. I was a little bit puzzled by its like winning Best Picture and all these sorts of things, and people talking about it like it's the greatest thing since sliced cheese. And I think it's a very, very good film. There's a lot that I admire in it, but I just don't quite understand the level of praise that it gets, if you know what I mean. But I was still really interested to see how Bong Joon-ho would direct this movie, because this is like a science fiction post-apocalyptic movie, and that seems very different from the other movies that I've heard of his. I've only seen these 2, but this is such a different film from Parasite, and I thought that this was an interesting movie. There certainly are a lot of ideas packed into it. You know, you have a sort of capitalism, the sort of idea of capitalism explored, economic inequality, you have sort of divine right of kings injected into it, you have this sort of twisted idea of the yin and yang from Taoism, yeah, and so you have all of these ideas packed into it, and yeah, but it doesn't quite live up to those ideas, I don't think. I think that the acting isn't spectacular. It does have Octavia Spencer, who I do rather like, and she was probably my favorite character. But you know, Chris Evans as the lead was just really not all that charismatic. I'm not sure how great an actor I think Chris Evans really is. And most of the other characters were just dull. You know, we're just not endearing. We're not that interesting. We learned very little about them. They had very little real personality. The one who I liked the most, maybe actually more than Octavia Spencer's character, is Tilda Swinton's character, who is a villain. You're not really supposed to like her, but she's so funny. She really just disappeared into that role. She is wonderful as this sort of right-hand man. She's a woman, but right-hand man to the leader, not leader, but creator and sort of head honcho of this train that all of humanity is living on in this sort of post-climate change world. And she is just wonderful. She's hilarious, but anyway, so the acting just wasn't great. The characters weren't that endearing. There are also a lot of plot holes, a lot of aspects of the plot that just don't make all that much sense. And in fact, the whole premise of the movie to me is just sort of absurd, because it's like this train that's moving forever throughout the world in this in this eternal winter, and somehow it's just moving forever, and the train tracks never freeze over, I guess, and somehow it never runs out of fuel, and so on and so forth, and somehow people still manage to get food inside of this train, and there are other plot holes throughout it, but yeah, it just felt like Bong Joon-ho had all these ideas he wanted to explore in this sort of cool little allegory for, economic inequality, but along the way of doing that, he just forgot to make the world make any sense, so that bugged me, but I did really like it. I did still enjoy it. It was sort of one of those movies that's like a solid 7 or 8 out of 10 for me. It's suspenseful, it's gripping. It does have interesting ideas, again, surrounding sort of economic inequality, class tensions, desire for power, the way that people rationalize things to each other, hierarchy, all of these things are explored in interesting ways, but they're just, I didn't feel anything about them, I didn't feel anything because the characters weren't that interesting. But yeah, it's a gripping movie. It's much more of an action suspense movie than I was expecting. And Bong Joon-ho, I think, does do action scenes really interestingly, because he doesn't do them in ways where there's a lot of quick shots where you're sort of getting a really sort of energetic look at the action. It's very much a sort of camera that just looks and stares as, someone's being butchered, you know what I mean? And that is really interesting and innovative, I think, and a really sort of important statement on his part, because, he's trying to get you to not look away from the horrific violence that takes place. Although, again, if that's not your thing, don't watch it. But anyway, so that's Snowpiercer, a little bit disappointing, but, on the whole, enjoyable. The next movie that I watched in my Wednesday film club, the Snowpiercer was for my Sunday film club. For the Wednesday Film Club, we watched Pieces of a Woman, directed by Kornél Mundruczó, and this, like Snowpiercer, this movie had a lot going for it. It has great lead performances by Vanessa Kirby especially, but also from Shia LaBeouf and one other actor whose name is escaping me, but great acting. Some really great scenes. This movie is well known for a 24-minute long take of a scene where Vanessa Kirby's character is giving birth in her home. And I did think that was a remarkable take, and what I thought made it a great long take was the fact that I didn't even realize it was a long take until like 10 minutes in, And I feel like that's great, because a lot of long takes in art house movies are like self-consciously long takes, They're like, ooh, I'm the art house director who's gonna, move the camera around in really fancy ways, and, and that, there was none of that here. It was done in a way where you didn't even notice it, and that makes me think that it was the right way to do it. And so I really liked that long take. Again, the acting is really good. There are some really interesting and touching scenes, but it just didn't cohere for me. It seems to chase its tail in the second half and not quite to know what it wants to do with itself and where it wants to go with its story. Some of the character motivations are really weird and hard to pin down, and also, it's sort of a story of grief. It's about a woman who loses a child in childbirth, and her husband's sort of experience after that, of grief. And what bugged me about this exploration of grief was that there's this civil suit against the midwife who was delivering the baby, because Vanessa Kirby's mother thinks that the midwife is to blame, Shia LaBeouf's character thinks that the midwife is to blame, and so in this experience of grief, there's this external, villain that they're all pointing to, and the midwife isn't a villain. I mean, it basically, Vanessa Kirby's character ends up forgiving her, and she wasn't at fault, obviously, but there is this external object that can be pointed to as sort of the villain, and I don't find that that's, in my experience with grief, that there is ever that external object to point the finger at, you know what I mean? Grief is a much more, in my experience, much more nebulous and difficult to deal with than that, and so there were a lot of really great scenes, a lot of really great lines, a lot of good acting, but it just didn't all hold together, you know what I mean? It's like a meal where each individual dish is really excellent, but they just don't go together well. Yeah, so anyway, it's hard to recommend it, you know? Anyway, so that's Pieces of a Woman. We'll move on from it now, but the last film, I gotta say, is thankfully the opposite of these other two. These other two have been very mixed. There have been good and bad things, but this movie is one of my favorite movies, and this is Melancholia, directed by Lars von Trier. This movie, I think, explores depression and anxiety in extremely interesting ways. You know, it's about two sisters, one of whom is played by Kirsten Dunst, really well by Kirsten Dunst. I don't tend to love Kirsten Dunst, but I think she puts in a really good performance in this movie. And another sister named named Claire, who's played by Charlotte Gainsbourg, who I love. Kirsten Dunst's character is profoundly depressed, and Charlotte Gainsbourg's character also clearly suffers from a degree of anxiety, you know, beyond just the anxiety that we all tend to feel at various points in our life. She has an anxiety disorder, it seems to me, and it explores their two approaches to life in extremely interesting ways by putting them in this impossible situation where a planet is hurtling towards Earth, another planet is going to crash into Earth and destroy it, and their responses to it are indicative of their approaches to life, of their sort of mental illness that they suffer from. And for Kirsten Dunst's character, the end of the world is not all that bad a thing, because she's depressed, she sees the world as evil, and so this isn't a bad thing, so she's very calm about it. But then Charlotte Gainsbourg's character suffers from anxiety, and I think, you know, one thing that I got from this movie this time around, it's my second time watching it, one thing that I got from it is that, you know, anxiety is like being too in love with the world, in a way, you know, like the opposite of an enlightened Buddhist or something like that. And she is just so in love with the world, with her son, who is a character who's played really well by a child actor, and with her husband, and so on and so forth, that she doesn't want to let go of it. So I think that the way that this film sort of explores depression and anxiety is extremely interesting. I think depression in particular is extremely well portrayed in the first half. And I think another reason that this movie resonates with me is because when I was very young, I had kind of an obsession with disaster scenarios and apocalypses, but not in a way that was like at all healthy. It was in a way where I was like constantly anxious and nervous and terrified that something was going to happen, like, you know, that, you know, when December 21st, 2012 end of the world sort of thing was becoming a big thing. I did way too much internet research about that and was so nervous, and, you know, in retrospect, of course, it's silly and easy to laugh about, but at the time it was just not healthy. And there were other things, you know, you can imagine how I felt when I found out about climate change, but I'm much better about that now. But because of, I think, my, you know, sort of struggle with anxiety over the apocalypse when I was younger, Charlotte Gainsbourg's character in particular resonates with me for the way that she shows all this paranoia and fear over the end of the world. And I think that might be a reason that this movie really resonates with me. But another thing that I noticed this time around that I could not have noticed last time I watched it, like with Moby-Dick, I couldn't have noticed all those literary references last time I read it. This time, watching this movie, I noticed all of these artistic and literary references. You know, you have the prelude to Tristan and Isolde playing at the beginning and sort of acting as a leitmotif throughout the film, and I love Wagner, so I love that. We see a couple of times we see Hunters in the Snow by Peter Bruegel the Elder, one of my favorite paintings. We see a reference to that famous painting of Ophelia, which then puts us in the mind of Hamlet. And there are just all of these artistic references that I really appreciated this time around, and I love sort of nerding out over things like that. There's also, I think, a reference to Tarkovsky, to both Solaris and Mirror, and to 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is cool since I just watched it. Yeah, anyway, so I love Melancholia. I definitely recommend this one. Unlike the other two, I can wholeheartedly recommend it. It's a really good movie. And then finally, I'm going to end out with the two television shows that I have sort of started. The first one is Northern Exposure, which was recommended to me by Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse, who tried to convince me to buy a $40 box set of the show because he thought I would love it so much, and I just said, you know, I'm not going to spend $40 on a show that I've never even seen. So, I rented it from the library, and so I watched the first episode, and it is a lot of fun. I think it is going to be a lot of fun. It takes place in Alaska, which is sort of a landscape that I really love, but it also just has really funny and endearing characters. So I'll check back in when I finish that show. And then another docu-series, actually, that I started is called Age of Samurai: Battle for Japan, and this was just released on Netflix, and it's about a period in Japanese history that I find fascinating, about the Japanese Civil War, when Japan was sort of divided between a lot of different daimyo lords who were vying for power in Japan. So I think it takes place in the 1500s, I believe, but it starts with the story of Oda Nobunaga, who and Tokugawa Ieyasu, one of whom I know was the warlord who finally united Japan under one banner. And yeah, I think I'm gonna continue to watch it because it's a subject matter that I find fascinating, and that I actually do know a fair amount about, because there was a documentary that I watched when I was a lot younger that I loved, and I watched it like on repeat, so I still like have it memorized. But the one thing about this documentary is that it is extremely like melodramatic. You know, there are a lot of reenactments, and I don't really understand why so many history documentaries feel the need to have these reenactments with dramatic, reproductions of battles or scenes from history with really bad actors and really bad scripts. It's like, you know, why can't people just do history documentaries like Ken Burns? You know what I mean? Why can't people just be satisfied with showing us the documentary evidence or something like that? You know, why do documentary makers these days feel that no one will be interested in a historical subject unless there's some sort of, you know, big bombastic battle scene, you know? It really does kind of annoy me. And I also found in the first episode that they didn't always go into the detail that I would have liked, you know, in terms of like battle tactics, fighting technology, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so it's a little bit inadequate and a little bit melodramatic for me, but again, I think I find the subject matter interesting enough that I will continue with it. But yeah, anyway. So that's my Sunday Miscellany. I don't know quite how long it's going to be, but I know it's going to be long, so my apologies once again. I will leave timestamps as always, although I'm saying that at the end of the video, as though that's helpful now. But anyway, I hope you all enjoyed. Give me your thoughts on any of these if you've read, watched, or listened to any of them, and I'll let you all go. Bye.